All right. So learning objective 3 here um, explains certainly the benefits and some limitations regarding activity-based costing. And there are three primary benefits, and that is by identifying more cost pools in those processes of production, you can have a more accurate product costing method. And so that's certainly the biggest of, I think, the three. Um, Certainly, if you know all those, you can have more control over your costs because you might be able to think of ways to reduce them. And you can also make better management decisions when you have all that. So there are some benefits, a lot of benefits to it. So this idea of multiple cost pools, right? Breaking things down by activity, so you can identify the cost drivers and see how much cost is being allocated to each product, right? To produce each product based on this. Brilliant idea, right? In essence, it takes a lot of time, as you see. One of the limitations of it coming up will be just how time consuming all this stuff is. So here again, focusing in on the overhead costs in total, right? We identify the activity cost pools for a particular process. So this is, Atlas machining activities from drilling and milling, um, cutting and trimming, all the way to sewing. These are all the individual cost pools that attribute to overhead. And then specifically the cost driver within that pool, what's taking up the vast majority of the time here. So machine hours or labor hours or material or parts, et cetera, right? Square footage or square inches, et cetera. So that means that by identifying each of these, you can keep better eye on all these particular costs. And thus, if you find ways to reduce them, you can make better decisions, because you certainly don't want to make a decision that, basically sacrifices any quality in getting products done. Um, but and you can define that better if you know more detail about the process. So this is an important type of issue. One thing that you're going to learn in this part of the chapter is how they classify things. There's four different ways of how they classify activity levels. The first is the unit level activity. And this is basically for each unit of production, that activity level would be considered a unit level activity level. So each individual assembly of a cell phone would be a unit level activity. For a batch level, of course, these products are produced in batches, right? And so a batch level activity is simply, every time the company produces another batch of a particular product, they can identify the activity based on that and classify it accordingly. It's the batch level activity. Product level activities are very specific to new types of products. Okay, so any time that's spent developing a new drug, testing a new drug, et cetera, could be classified as a product level activity, which is different than a unit level, which is actually putting together the product. So that's it. And it gets bigger here with facility level. In this case, the entire production process needs to be supported and maintained based on the facility. So whether that's a whole factory, or your book has the example of a hospital, you're looking at everything that's revolving around the actual facility would be how to classify those types of activity levels. So there are going to be questions about this, and this is a very nice illustration. It's on page 147 in your book. And again, it shows the different, the 4 levels of activity, unit, batch, product, and facility. Then the types of activities and the types of cost drivers that are listed. Okay. Um, and so all of those are important because you're going to have questions coming up that have you identify things as either unit level activity or a batch level activity or a product level activity or a facility level activity. So they're going to ask you to classify them in these parts. So these were examples of the cost drivers, again, examples of the activities in each of these categories or classifications. Then they introduce you to something called a value added activity. There's also non-value added activities, but a value added activity, at least in the eyes of the customer, increase the value of a product because the company is doing it. So what activities increase the value to the customer, right, of a product or a service? Well, for a manufacturing company, the type of design of the product would increase, in essence, the perceived value. How it's put together and assembled, how it's painted, et cetera. These types of things really increase the value, at least the perceived value of a product, and thus add a lot to what the company is doing. For a service type company, it's usually revolving around the type of work that it's doing, whether it's performing a surgery, or it's known for its legal research, or it's known for how quickly it can deliver packages, et cetera. These activities are all considered value added activities that the company is doing. But of course, the company does a lot more than that. But to the customer, they don't really see these as adding any value to the activity. And so for a manufacturing company, for example, storage of inventory or even moving inventory, it adds costs to the employer, but it doesn't add any real value in the eyes of the consumer to that product. It certainly costs money. It increases the time spent on this type of thing, but it doesn't do much in terms of the consumer's perceived value. For a service company, taking appointments or reception or billing and bookkeeping and so forth, add costs to, if this is happening in a hospital, certainly add costs to it, but it doesn't have any perceived value in terms of the customer. And so these are considered non-value added activities. So again, your book's going to ask you to identify and differentiate between the two. And then there's just a few more things here in this part of the chapter that talks a little bit about, again, the advantages and limitations, right? So there's a whole management tool called activity-based management that really looks at reducing costs overwhelmingly and improving the process of getting perhaps a product done or a service delivered. And there's a lot of these types. You'll hear a whole bunch of different ways that people are coming up with to give tools to management to get these things done. But basically speaking, it's one of a half a dozen of methods that are being used today. There are, of course, some limitations to using activity-based costing and activity-based management. And like I mentioned earlier, it's just very expensive. It's very, very time-consuming, and it's very expensive to use. And it's even if you have all these facts put together and certain things, it doesn't take away that there are some allocations and decisions that are going to be somewhat arbitrary, not necessarily based on what you know. Um, and so that's basically some of the limitations for activity-based costing here. And so here you go. Your do it exercise for activity for learning objective 3 is classifying these activities for Morgan Toy Company. They have 6 product lines at its Morganville plant. The accounting department has identified 8 activity cost pools. These toys are produced in very large batches, and the whole facility is devoted to producing one product at a time. So they want you to classify all of these, A through H, as either a unit level activity, a batch level activity, a product level activity, or a facility level activity. Okay. And so that's what you're going to have homework exactly like this. So when you look at engineering, and this is where the that lovely illustration comes in handy. When you're looking at engineering, this is really about where the product is designed and so forth. So engineering usually tends to be a product level activity. Right? Um, and so as you'll see, that's what it is. Setting up the machines to get certain things done, right? This basically becomes part of a batch level, right? Every time they go ahead and produce a batch, they have to set up all these machines to get that done, batch level. The design of a toy happens early on, and it's part of the product itself, so it's a product level activity. Um, Getting the employees in place, interviewed and hired, is basically you need employees to run the facility. So this would be considered a facility level activity. Inspections after every time things are set up happens every time a batch is run or prepared to be run. So that's a batch level activity. Polishing the parts um, before they are part of that assembly is going to go into every unit. So it's a unit, parts go into the unit. So it's going to be a unit level activity. Assembling those parts, again, are part of putting together the unit. So it's a unit level activity. And the health and safety of all involved is a facility level activity. So that's the basic emphasis of objective 3. So we'll take a quick break for questions here.